The red dust of Haven 7 swirled around the settlement as another day began on the frontier world. This wasn't Earth with its blue skies and green fields. Here, 2 suns burned overhead, casting everything in an orange glow that made the human. Colonists squint even through their protective gear. They had come here seeking a new life, but what they found was a world already claimed by the Valari. The Valari weren't like humans at all. They stood taller, with skin that shimmered like moonlight on water, marked with silver streaks that seemed to flow like rivers across their bodies. Their eyes held colors that humans had no names for, deep violets and shifting purples that seemed to hold ancient wisdom. They moved with a grace that made human steps seem clumsy and loud. For 3 years the two peoples had lived side by side, but never together. The humans built their concrete structures and metal walls, while the Valari dwelt in organic buildings that seemed to grow from the very ground. Trade happened at the border, quick exchanges of goods with few words spoken. Children from both sides were warned to stay away from the other species, but some rules are meant to be broken. Jinho had always been different from the other human colonists. While they complained about the alien world and counted the days until their contracts ended, he found beauty in Haven 7's strange landscape. As an agricultural specialist, his job was to make earth crops grow in alien soil. It was harder than anyone expected. The plants would sprout, grow for a few weeks, then wither and die. The colonists were running out of food, and supply ships from Earth came only twice a year. It was during one of his desperate searches for solutions that Jinho first met Nira. He had wandered beyond the human settlement, following rumors of a valley where strange plants grew. The Valari weren't supposed to help humans, and humans weren't supposed to ask for help. But hunger makes people do unexpected things. She appeared like a ghost among the silver-leafed trees, her violet eyes watching him with curiosity rather than fear. When she spoke, her voice carried the musical quality that all Valari possessed, but her words were in perfect human language. "You seek the growing place," she said simply. Jinho nodded, too surprised to speak. No Valari had ever spoken directly to him before. "Your plants die because you fight the soil," Nira continued, kneeling beside a patch of earth tomatoes that had somehow grown large and healthy. "Haven 7 does not want to be Earth, but maybe it can be something new." That first meeting led to others. Nira would slip away from her people when the moons were dark, meeting Jinho in the hidden valley. She showed him how Valari plants could be crossed with human crops, creating new varieties that thrived in Haven 7's unique conditions. The work was slow, requiring patience and trust that neither species was supposed to have for the other. But somewhere between the late nights spent tending seedlings and the quiet conversations about their different worlds, something else began to grow. Jinho found himself looking forward to their meetings for reasons that had nothing to do with agriculture. Nira would smile when she saw him approaching, an expression that made the alien features of her face seem suddenly familiar and beautiful. Their love was as forbidden as it was natural. Both species had strict laws against mixing with the other. The humans called it contamination, the Valari called it corruption. But in the green sanctuary of their hidden valley, such words seemed meaningless. They were simply two people who had found something precious in each other. The end came suddenly. Jinho's communication device, which he had forgotten in Nira's dwelling after spending the night, was discovered by a Valari patrol. The small piece of human technology was like a beacon, announcing their secret to both worlds. The news spread through both settlements like wildfire. Within hours, everyone knew that Nira, daughter of the respected healer Kess, had been found with human technology in her home. The implications were clear to both species, and the reaction was swift and brutal. Jinho ran through the human settlement, his boots pounding against the metal walkways as he searched for anyone who would listen. His face was streaked with dust. Hand desperation as he burst into the administration building, where Colonel Daewon sat reviewing supply reports. "Sir, you have to help her," Jinho gasped, still catching his breath. "They're going to put her on trial. This is about more than just us. The work we've been doing, the crops we've developed. They could save both our peoples." Colonel Daewon barely looked up from his papers. His weathered face showed no emotion as he spoke in a flat, official tone. "Specialist Jinho, You have violated direct orders by fraternizing with the alien population. Consider yourself lucky that we're not the ones putting you on trial. But, sir, she's innocent. All we did was try to solve the food crisis. The hybrid crops we developed could feed thousands. What you did, the colonel said, finally meeting his eyes, was compromise the security of this settlement and violate the non-interference protocols. The Valari have their own justice system. It's not our place to interfere. Jinho felt the world spinning around him. He had expected anger, punishment, maybe even imprisonment. But this cold indifference was worse than any rage. She's going to die because of me. You have to understand. I understand perfectly, Colonel Daewon replied, returning to his papers. You let your emotions cloud your judgment, and now there are consequences. Report to your quarters. You're confined until further notice. Meanwhile, in the heart of the Valari settlement, the High Circle gathered in their ancient meeting place. The building was unlike anything humans had constructed on Haven 7. Its walls seemed to breathe, made from living wood that had been shaped rather than cut. Soft light filtered through translucent panels that pulsed gently like a heartbeat. Matriarch. Zephys stood at the center of the circle, her silver hair flowing like liquid metal down her back. Her age was impossible to determine by human standards, but her presence commanded absolute respect from the other circle members. When she spoke, her voice carried the authority of centuries. Nera of the Healing House, she began, her words echoing in the sacred space. You stand accused of blood corruption, of allowing your essence to mingle with that of the outsiders. How do you answer? Nera stood in the center of the circle, her head held high despite the chains that bound her wrists. The silver streaks on her skin seemed dimmer than usual, as if her inner light had been dampened by shame and fear, but her voice remained steady when she spoke. I answer that I have loved, she said simply. I have loved one who sees beyond the differences between our peoples. I have loved one who worked beside me to create life where there was only death. A murmur ran through the circle. Elder Thane, his face marked by ritual scars that spoke of his orthodox beliefs, stepped forward with obvious disgust. Love? He spat. You call this abomination love? You have polluted the purity of our bloodline. You have betrayed everything our ancestors died to preserve. I have created something new, Nera replied, her violet eyes meeting his without flinching. The crops we developed together could end hunger for both our peoples. Is that not worth something? Matriarch Zephys raised her hand for silence. The gesture was small, but it commanded immediate attention from everyone present. The law is clear, she said, her voice heavy with what might have been regret. Blood corruption carries only one penalty. You will hang at dawn as a warning to any who might follow your path. The sentence fell like a physical blow. Nera's composure finally cracked, not from fear of death, but from the knowledge that her work, their work, would die with her. The hybrid crops in the Hidden Valley would wither without care. The bridge she and Jinho had tried to build between their peoples would crumble before anyone else could cross it. As the circle dispersed, Nera was led away to spend her final night in solitude, while across the settlement divide, Jinho sat in his quarters, unaware that the woman he loved had already been condemned to die. The first sun of Haven 7 painted the sky in shades of amber and gold as dawn broke over the divided world. In the human settlement, most colonists were still asleep in their metal barracks, unaware of what was about to unfold just beyond their walls. The second sun would rise in an hour, bringing the full heat of the day, but for now the air was cool and still. Private Minho adjusted his rifle strap as he walked the perimeter patrol route. At 19, he was one of the youngest soldiers in the garrison, barely old enough to be trusted with guard duty. His face still held the softness of youth, unmarked by the hard lines that years of frontier life carved into older men. Unlike the veterans who had grown bitter from 3 years of tension with the Valari, Minho still wondered about the tall, graceful beings who lived so close yet remained complete strangers. The patrol route took him along the ridge that overlooked the valley separating the two settlements. From this height, he could see both communities spread out below. The human settlement was all straight lines and practical buildings, while the Valerie homes curved and flowed like they had grown from the earth itself. He had always thought it looked peaceful from up here, like two different gardens planted side by side. But today something was different. In the distance, near the center of the Valerie settlement, a crowd had gathered around what looked like a massive tree. Even from far away, Minho could see that it was no ordinary gathering. The Valerie moved with a solemnity that made his stomach clench with unease. The ancient judgment tree was older than both settlements, older perhaps than human civilization itself. Its trunk was so wide that 20 people holding hands could not encircle it, and its branches reached toward the sky like desperate fingers. The bark was smooth and dark, polished by centuries of wind and rain. The Valerie believed it was sacred, a connection between their world and the spirits of their ancestors. Nira walked toward the tree with steady steps, flanked by 2 guards whose faces showed no emotion. Her hands were bound behind her back, but she held her head high. The silver streaks on her skin caught the morning light, making her seem to glow from within even in her final moments. She wore the simple white robes of the condemned, and her feet were bare against the soft earth. The entire Valerie community had come to witness the execution. They stood in silent circles around the judgment tree, their violet and purple eyes reflecting the morning sun. Children were kept at the back, shielded by their parents from the harsh reality of justice. But even they seemed to understand the weight of the moment. Matriarch Zephys stood beneath the great tree, her ceremonial staff planted firmly in the ground. The rope had already been prepared, hanging from a thick branch like a deadly vine. 2 guards lifted Nira onto a platform made from living wood that had been coaxed to grow in the shape needed for this grim purpose. Nira of the Healing House. The matriarch's voice carried clearly in the still air. You have been found guilty of blood corruption. Do you have final words before the sentence is carried out? Nira looked out over the gathered crowd, her violet eyes searching the faces of people she had known all her life. When she spoke, her voice was clear and strong, carrying the musical quality that made even her last words sound like a song. I do not ask for forgiveness, she said, her words echoing off the valley walls. I ask only for understanding. The barriers between our peoples are built from fear, not wisdom. What I shared with the human Jinho was not corruption but hope. Hope that our children might one day see each other not as enemies, but as neighbors under the same suns. She paused, closing her eyes as if gathering strength for what came next. I have seen what we could become together. I have touched the possibility of a future where hunger does not divide us, where difference does not mean hatred. That vision dies with me today, but perhaps someday someone else will have the courage to dream it again. The rope was placed around her neck with ritualistic precision. Matriarch Zephys raised her staff, and in that moment, Nira's composure finally broke. She cried out, not in fear for herself, but in anguish for all the possibilities that would die with her. Her voice rose and fell like a lament, carrying across the valley with a power that seemed to make the very air tremble. On the ridge above, Private Minho froze as the sound reached him. He had heard screams before, heard the cries of wounded, soldiers and dying animals. But this was different. This cry carried something that cut through all his military training, all the warnings about keeping emotional distance from the aliens. It was the sound of a heart breaking, of hope being extinguished, of love being murdered. Something inside the young soldier cracked open, and for the first time since arriving on Haven 7, he truly saw the Valerie not as aliens, but as people. The sound of Nira's final cry haunted Minho for days. Every time he closed his eyes, he heard it echoing across the valley like a ghost refusing to rest. Sleep became impossible, and food tasted like ash in his mouth. His fellow soldiers noticed the change, but said nothing. Everyone dealt with the harsh realities of frontier life differently, but Minho couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong about the whole situation. He had been trained to follow orders without question, to see the Valerie as potential threats rather than neighbors. Yet Nira's words before her death kept replaying in his mind. She had spoken of hope, of ending hunger, of building bridges between their peoples. These didn't sound like the words of someone guilty of corruption. 3 nights after the execution, Minho made a decision that could cost him his career. During his patrol shift, instead of following his assigned route, he slipped away from the human settlement and made his way toward the valley that separated the two communities. The moons were dark, providing perfect cover for his unauthorized expedition. The valley was different at night. Strange flowers that only bloomed in darkness cast a soft blue glow across the landscape. The air was filled with unfamiliar scents, sweet and earthy at the same time. Minho had never ventured this far from the settlement alone, and every shadow seemed to hide potential danger. It took him 2 hours of careful searching before he found what he was looking for. Hidden in a grove of silverleaf trees was a small shelter, barely visible unless you knew where to look. It was built in the Valari style, with walls that curved like water and a roof that seemed to blend seamlessly with the canopy above. Inside, Minho's flashlight revealed something extraordinary. The shelter was filled with plants unlike anything he had ever seen. Earth tomatoes grew alongside Valari fruit vines, their branches intertwined in impossible ways. Grain crops from both worlds had been crossed to create something entirely new. The air inside was thick with the smell of rich soil and growing things, but it was the papers scattered across a makeshift desk that made Minho's heart race. Written in both human script and Valari symbols were detailed notes about agricultural experiments. Charts showed crop yields that were 3 times higher than anything either species had achieved alone. There were sketches of root systems, genetic diagrams, and calculations that proved these hybrid plants could grow in Haven 7's difficult soil without the expensive fertilizers shipped from Earth. At the bottom of one page, written in careful, human handwriting, were the words, "For Nira, who showed me that difference can be strength." It was signed with the name Jinho. As Minho read through more of the research, the scope of the discovery became clear. These two people hadn't just been lovers. They had been on the verge of solving the food crisis that plagued both settlements. The hybrid crops could feed thousands, end the dependence on supply ships, and make Haven 7 truly self-sufficient. But there was something else in the papers that made Minho's blood run cold. Hidden among the research notes were shipping manifests and communication logs that told a different story. Companies back on Earth were making enormous profits from the constant supply runs to Haven 7. Military contractors grew rich from the weapons and security equipment needed to maintain the tense peace between the species. The logs showed communications between certain human officials and Valari leaders, discussing ways to maintain the status quo. There were references to sabotaging peace talks, to staged incidents that would keep tensions high, and to the profits that flowed from keeping both species dependent and divided. One name appeared repeatedly in these communications: Colonel Daewon, Minho's own commanding officer. The man who had refused to help Jinho save Nira was apparently part of a conspiracy that benefited from her death. Minho sat back on his heels, his mind reeling from the implications. Nira hadn't died because she loved a human. She had died because she and Jinho had discovered something that threatened a profitable status quo. Their hybrid crops would have ended the need for supply ships, military escorts, and all the expensive infrastructure that kept certain people very rich. The conspiracy went deeper than just military and agricultural interests. There were medical supply companies that profited from treating malnutrition, weapons manufacturers who sold security systems to both settlements, and transportation companies that charged enormous fees for interstellar shipping. All of them had a vested interest in keeping Haven 7 divided and dependent. As dawn approached, Minho carefully photographed the most important documents with his personal communicator. He had to be smart about this. Going to his superiors was pointless when his commanding officer was part of the conspiracy. But he couldn't stay silent either. Nira had died for trying to build something beautiful between their peoples, and her death was being used to maintain a system built on greed and hatred. Walking back to the settlement as the first sun rose, Minho made a decision that would change everything. He was going to find Jinho, wherever the man was hiding, and together they would expose the truth. It wouldn't bring Nira back, but maybe it would ensure that her sacrifice hadn't been completely in vain. The young soldier had no idea that his investigation would soon make him a target of the same conspiracy that had killed the woman whose cry still echoed in his dreams. Finding Jinho proved harder than Minho had expected. The agricultural specialist had vanished from the human settlement the day after Nira's execution, leaving behind only his official duties and a resignation letter that said nothing about where he was going. For 3 days, Minho used his off-duty hours to search the wilderness around Haven 7, following rumors and half-glimpsed sightings from other patrol units. He finally found Jinho in a cave system about 10 kilometers north of the settlements. The man was barely recognizable. His clothes were torn and dirty, his face covered with an unkempt beard, and his eyes held the hollow look of someone who had lost everything that mattered. Empty food containers scattered around the cave showed he had been surviving on emergency rations, probably stolen from supply drops. "Go away," Jinho said when he saw Minho's uniform. His voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. "I don't want to talk to anyone from the settlement, especially not soldiers." "I'm not here as a soldier," Minho replied, carefully setting down his rifle and raising his hands to show he meant no harm. "I'm here because I heard her die. I heard Nira's last cry, and I can't get it out of my head." Something flickered in Jinho's eyes at the mention of her name. "You don't know anything about her." "I know she was trying to save both our peoples," Minho said, pulling out the photographs he had taken in the hidden valley. "I found your research. I found the hybrid crops, and I found something else." Jinho's attention sharpened as Minho showed him the pictures of the conspiracy documents. As he scrolled through the images on the communicator, his expression changed from grief to anger to something cold and dangerous. "I should have known," Jinho muttered, his hands shaking slightly. The timing was too perfect. Someone always seemed to know exactly when our meetings were happening. Someone always knew where to look. Over the next hour, the two men pieced together a picture that was even worse than Minho had imagined. Using Jinho's inside knowledge of the agricultural program and Minho's access to military communications, they began to see the full scope of the conspiracy. The attacks that had kept tensions high between the species weren't random acts of extremism. They were carefully planned operations designed to maintain just enough hostility to justify the massive security and supply operations that kept certain people wealthy. A damaged water treatment plant here, a stolen shipment there, always with just enough evidence to point blame at the other species. "Look at this," Jinho said, pointing to a communication log on Minho's device. 3 weeks ago there was a raid on our grain storage facility. The official report blamed Valari extremists, but look at the timing. It happened 2 days after Nira and I successfully grew our first full crop of hybrid wheat. The pattern became clear as they dug deeper. Every time there was progress toward cooperation between the species, something would happen to set them back. Peace talks would be disrupted by mysterious attacks, trade negotiations would collapse after convenient incidents, and always the same companies profited from the resulting chaos. But the most chilling discovery came when they found Nira's personal notes hidden in a coded section of the research files. She had been documenting the conspiracy for months, collecting evidence of the staged attacks and false flag operations. Her graceful handwriting described meetings she had observed, conversations she had overheard, and connections she had made between seemingly unrelated incidents. "She knew," Jinho whispered, tears streaming down his face. "She knew they were using us. She was going to expose them all." The final entry in Nira's notes was dated just 2 days before her capture. In it, she described her plan to reveal the conspiracy during the upcoming harvest festival, when both species would gather for their annual trade negotiations. She had arranged to meet with moderate leaders from both communities, people who would listen to evidence and act on it. But someone had discovered her plan. The convenient finding of Jinho's communication device in her dwelling hadn't been an accident. It had been planted there, giving the conspirators the excuse they needed to silence her before she could speak. "They killed her to protect their profits," Minho said, the full horror of the situation settling over him. "They turned her love into a crime to hide their real crime." Jinho stood up suddenly, his grief transforming into determination. "Then we finish what she started. We expose them all no matter what it costs us." "It'll be dangerous," Minho warned. These people have already killed once to protect their secret. They won't hesitate to kill again. Good, Jinho replied, his voice hard as steel. Let them try. Nira died believing that our peoples could live together in peace. I'm not going to let her die for nothing. As the two men began planning their next move, neither of them knew that their meeting in the cave had already been observed. Hidden cameras, placed by the same conspiracy they sought to expose, had recorded every word they spoke. The hunters were about to become the hunted. The first person they approached was Dr. Yunji, a human xenobiologist who had arrived on Haven 7 6 months earlier as part of a research exchange program. Unlike most of the colonists, she had shown genuine interest in understanding Valari culture and biology. Her small laboratory on the edge of the human settlement was filled with specimens from both species, and she had been quietly advocating for more cooperative research. Minho found her late one evening, working alone in her lab under the glow of specimen lights. When he knocked on the door, she looked up with surprise. Few soldiers ever visited the science facilities, and none had ever come to see her specifically. Dr. Yunji, Minho began nervously, I need to talk to you about something important, something that could change everything on Haven 7, she set down her microscope and studied his face. At 35, Dr. Yunji had learned to read people well, and she could see that this young soldier was carrying a heavy burden. Come in, she said simply, and close the door behind you. When Minho showed her the evidence from Nira's research, Dr. Yunji's reaction was immediate and intense. Her hands trembled as she scrolled through the photographs, and her face grew pale as the implications became clear. I knew something was wrong, she whispered. The attacks, the timing, the way every peace initiative seemed to fall apart just when progress was being made. But I never imagined it was this organized. Dr. Yunji's scientific mind quickly grasped the full scope of what Nira and Jinho had discovered. She had been struggling with her own research because she couldn't get approval for cross-species studies. Now she understood why. The hybrid crops weren't just a solution to the food crisis, they were proof that cooperation between the species could work. There's someone else who needs to see this, she said, after studying the evidence for an hour. A Valari scientist named Kyle. He worked with Nira before her arrest. He's been asking questions that his superiors don't want to answer. Making contact with Kyle required careful planning. The Valari scientist worked in their bio-research facility, a building that humans were forbidden from entering. But Dr. Yunji had developed a system for exchanging research data with him through dead drops, leaving samples and notes in a hollow tree that stood exactly halfway between the two settlements. When Kyle found the request for a secret meeting, in their usual drop location, his first instinct was suspicion. The message was written in Dr. Yunji's careful handwriting, but it asked him to take risks that could cost him his life. Still, something about the urgency in her words made him agree to the meeting. They met in an abandoned mining station that predated both settlements, a relic from Haven 7's brief mineral extraction period. The building was half buried in red sand, with rusted equipment scattered around like the bones of dead machines. It was the perfect place for a secret gathering. Kyle arrived first, his tall figure moving silently through the shadows. When Minho, Jinho, and Dr. Yunji appeared, he tensed visibly. Seeing humans, especially a soldier, made every instinct tell him to run. Wait, Dr. Yunji called softly. Kale, you trusted me enough to come here, trust me enough to listen. The young Valari scientist was about Minho's age, with the same kind of curious eyes that hadn't yet been hardened by years of disappointment. His silver-streaked skin seemed to glow in the dim light, filtering through the building's broken windows. When he spoke, his musical voice carried pain that transcended species barriers. Nira was my mentor, he said simply. She taught me that knowledge belongs to everyone, not just those who discover it. When she died, part of me died with her. Jinho stepped forward, his voice thick with emotion. Then help us make sure she didn't die for nothing. For the next 2 hours, they shared everything they had discovered. Kyle's eyes widened as he saw the evidence of the conspiracy, but he wasn't entirely surprised. He had noticed irregularities in his own work, requests for research that made no scientific sense, and pressure to avoid certain areas of study. "I have access to Valari communication logs," Kale said finally. "If this conspiracy involves our leaders, there will be evidence in our records too." Over the following week, their small group worked in careful coordination. Dr. Unji used her legitimate research requests to cover meetings with Kael. Minho used his patrol duties to scout security weaknesses and gather intelligence on military communications. Jinho, still officially missing, remained hidden but coordinated their efforts through encrypted messages. What they discovered was worse than any of them had imagined. The conspiracy didn't just involve a few corrupt officials. It reached into the highest levels of both governments, with networks of people who profited from keeping Haven 7 divided and dependent. But they also found something else, evidence that many people in both communities were tired of the constant tension. There were letters from families wanting to trade with their neighbors, reports from scientists frustrated by artificial barriers to cooperation, and even military personnel who questioned orders that seemed designed to escalate rather than resolve conflicts. "The Harvest Festival is in 10 days, Dr. Unji said during one of their secret meetings. "Both species will send their leaders, and there will be media coverage broadcast back to Earth and the Valari homeworld. If we're going to expose this, that's our chance." "It's also when they'll expect us to act," Minho warned. "Security will be tight, and anyone involved in the conspiracy will be watching for threats." Kyle nodded gravely. "But it's also our best chance to reach people who can actually do something about this. If we can present the evidence publicly, in front of witnesses from both worlds, they can't simply make us disappear." As they finalized their plans, none of them noticed the small surveillance device hidden in the abandoned mining station's ventilation system. Their every word was being recorded, and their enemies were already preparing to stop them. The race was on to see who would act first. The trap was sprung at dawn, 3 days before the Harvest Festival. Minho was returning from what he thought was a routine patrol when he noticed something wrong. The usual morning bustle around the human settlement was too quiet, too organized. Soldiers moved with purpose that had nothing to do with their normal duties, and their eyes kept scanning the horizon as if searching for specific targets. His communication device buzzed with an urgent message from Dr. Unji. "They know. Get out now." Minho's blood turned to ice. He had been trained to recognize when a situation was about to go bad, and every instinct he possessed was screaming danger. Without hesitation, he changed direction and headed for the emergency rendezvous point they had established, in case their plans were discovered. The rendezvous was a small cave system, about 2 kilometers from both settlements, hidden in a rocky outcrop that most people avoided because of the unstable ground. When Minho arrived, he found the others already there, their faces grim with the knowledge that their secret was blown. "How did they find out?" Jinho asked, his voice tight with controlled panic. "Does it matter?" Dr. Unji replied, stuffing research. "Data into a waterproof bag. What matters is that Colonel Taehyung issued orders for our arrest 20 minutes ago. They're calling us terrorists who are planning to sabotage the Harvest Festival." Kael looked pale, his silver-streaked skin almost white with fear. "Elder Thane sent warriors to my dwelling. I barely escaped through the research facility's back entrance. They're saying I've been corrupted by human influence." The sound of vehicles approaching made them all freeze. Through the cave entrance, they could see military transports from both settlements converging on their location. Somehow their enemies had tracked them even to this hidden refuge. "The surveillance device," Minho realized with horror. "They've been watching us from the beginning." Colonel Taehyung's voice echoed from a loudspeaker mounted on one of the human vehicles. "This is Colonel Taehyung of the Haven 7 Security Force. You are surrounded and accused of conspiracy against both human and Valari interests. Surrender now, and you will be treated according to military law." From the Valari side, Elder Thane's ceremonial voice added its weight to the demand. "Kael of the Research House, you have violated the sacred laws of our people. Come forward and accept judgment, or face the consequences of defying the council." Minho felt the familiar calm that came over him in dangerous situations. His military training kicked in, analyzing their options with cold precision. The cave system they were hiding in was more extensive than it appeared from the outside. Local surveys had mapped only the main chambers, but there were rumors of deeper tunnels that connected to the crystal caves on the far side of the valley. "There's another way out," he told the others. "But it's dangerous. The crystal caves are unstable, and some of the passages flood during the rain season." "More dangerous than staying here?" Dr. Yunji asked, shouldering her pack of evidence. Outside, the sound of boots on stone indicated that soldiers from both species were beginning their assault on the cave entrance. Time was running out. Minho led them deeper into the cave system, using his flashlight to navigate passages that grew narrower and more treacherous with each step. The walls began to glitter with crystalline formations that gave the caves their name, beautiful but sharp enough to cut unwary travelers. Behind them, shouts and the beam of pursuit lights indicated that their hunters had discovered the deeper passages. The chase was on. "Move faster," Minho urged, though he knew that pushing too hard in the unstable caves could trigger a collapse that would kill them all. The pursuit was relentless. Colonel Tae-hyung had brought his best trackers, soldiers trained in cave warfare, and underground operations. But Minho had one advantage: desperation combined with intimate knowledge of military tactics. He knew how his former comrades would think, how they would approach the hunt. At a junction where 3 passages met, Minho made a decision that went against every survival instinct. Instead of taking the widest, safest route, he led them into a narrow crack in the cave wall that barely accommodated their bodies. "Trust me," he whispered when the others hesitated. The crack led to a chamber filled with crystal formations so delicate they seemed to sing in harmonious tones when air moved through them. But more importantly, it connected to a passage that led toward the broadcast station they needed to reach. Their plan had always been to use the Harvest Festival's communication array to broadcast their evidence to both worlds simultaneously. The festival's media coverage would ensure that their revelations reached audiences on Earth and the Valari homeworld, making it impossible for the conspiracy to simply silence them. But reaching the broadcast station meant crossing open ground, while being hunted by the combined security forces of both settlements. They would have one chance, and if they failed, they would disappear forever into the detention facilities that both species maintained for enemies of the state. As they emerged from the crystal caves on the far side of the valley, the broadcast tower loomed ahead of them like a metal finger pointing toward the stars. Around its base, they could see the temporary structures being erected for the Harvest Festival just 3 days away. "Almost there," Dr. Yunji panted, exhaustion evident in her voice. But Minho's trained eyes had spotted something that made his heart sink. The tower was already surrounded by security forces. Their enemies had anticipated their destination and were waiting for them. "It's a trap," he said quietly. "They want us to come to them." The question now was whether they had the courage to walk into that trap, knowing it might be their only chance to honor Nira's sacrifice and expose the truth that had cost her life. The Harvest Festival began at sunset, when both of Haven 7's suns painted the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple. For 1 day each year, the artificial barriers between human and Valari settlements came down as both species gathered to trade goods and negotiate agreements. The festival grounds lay in the neutral zone between the two communities, marked by colorful banners and temporary structures that had taken weeks to build. Minho watched the celebration from a hidden position in the rocky hills overlooking the festival site. Below, thousands of beings from both species mingled in carefully controlled groups. Human families browsed stalls, selling Valari crafts, while Valari merchants examined earth-grown vegetables. Children from both species played together under the watchful eyes of their parents, laughing in ways that transcended language barriers. It was beautiful and heartbreaking at the same time. This was what Nira had dreamed of, what she had died trying to create, but the harmony was artificial, maintained by security forces who ensured that interactions remained superficial and temporary. "The ceremony starts in 10 minutes, Dr. Yunji whispered, checking her equipment one final time. They had spent the last 3 days preparing for this moment, using Kyle's knowledge of Valari technology and Minho's military training to create a plan that might actually work. The key was the festival's communication array, a temporary network set up to broadcast the opening ceremony to both Earth and the Valerie homeworld. For a few crucial minutes, both species' leadership would be speaking to audiences across the galaxy, their words carried by satellites and relay stations that couldn't be easily shut down. Jinho crouched beside a jury-rigged transmitter, his hands steady, despite the magnitude of what they were about to attempt. Nira's message is loaded and ready. The conspiracy evidence is queued to follow immediately after. Before her death, Nira had recorded a personal message intended for Jinho alone, but it had become something much more powerful. In it, she spoke not just of their love, but of her vision for a future where both species could thrive together. Her words carried the musical quality of her voice and the wisdom of someone who had seen beyond the artificial divisions that kept their peoples apart. On the festival stage, Matriarch Zephys and Colonel Tae-hyung stood side by side, preparing to deliver the ceremonial opening remarks. The irony wasn't lost on Minho that two of the conspiracy's key figures were about to have their carefully constructed lies exposed on the largest possible stage. Citizens of Haven 7, Matriarch Zephys began, her voice carrying clearly through the sound system. Today we gather as we have for 3 years to maintain the peaceful coexistence that has served both our peoples. Colonel Tae-hyung stepped forward to add his own words. This festival represents the careful balance we have achieved, the stability that protects both human and Valari interests. That was their cue. Dr. Yunji activated the override sequence she had spent days programming, using access codes that Kyle had obtained from the Valari communication systems. For a moment, nothing seemed to happen. Then the screens around the festival site flickered and went dark. When the images returned, they showed not the stage ceremony but Nira's face. Even in death, her beauty was striking, her violet eyes seeming to look directly at each viewer as if speaking to them personally. "My name is Nira of the Healing House," her recorded voice began, the musical tones carrying clearly across the suddenly silent festival grounds. "If you are hearing this message, then I am already dead, executed for the crime of loving someone from another species." The crowd's reaction was immediate and electric. Valerie, who had supported her execution, suddenly found themselves face to face with the woman they had condemned. Humans who had never seen her alive now witnessed the grace and intelligence that had captured Jinho's heart. "But my death is not about love," Nira's message continued. "I was killed because I discovered a truth that certain people wanted to keep hidden. Both our species are being manipulated by those who profit from our division." As Nira's words unfolded, Dr. Yunji's system began broadcasting the evidence they had gathered. Financial records appeared on the screens, showing money flowing from Earth corporations to maintain Haven 7's expensive supply chains. Communication logs revealed coordination between human and Valerie extremists. The conspiracy was laid bare for everyone to see. The festival grounds erupted in chaos. Some people stood frozen in shock, while others began shouting in anger or disbelief. Security forces tried to shut down the broadcast, but the signal was being transmitted through multiple channels simultaneously. Colonel Tae-hyung's voice cut through the noise as he grabbed the microphone. "This is enemy propaganda designed to destabilize our communities. Do not believe these lies." But his words only made things worse. People in the crowd began connecting dots, remembering suspicious incidents and questionable decisions. A human merchant stood up and shouted, "My supply shipments were delayed every time I tried to trade with the Valerie. Now I know why." A Valari trader added her voice. "The attacks on our transport routes always happened when we were negotiating better prices with human buyers." The revelations spread through the crowd like wildfire. 3 years of carefully maintained tensions suddenly made sense in a new and terrible way. Both species had been played against each other for profit, their natural desire for cooperation twisted into artificial hostility. But something else was happening too. As the shock wore off, people began to see each other differently. Human parents looked at Valerie children and saw not aliens, but young beings who deserved a future free from manipulation. Valerie elders looked at human families and saw not invaders, but neighbors who had been deceived just as thoroughly as themselves. The demonstrations began spontaneously. First a few voices, then dozens, then hundreds of people from both species began chanting together. They called for justice for Nira, for punishment of those who had betrayed them, and for a chance to build the cooperative future that had been stolen from them. From his hiding place in the hills, Minho watched as Haven 7 began to transform. The truth had been painful, but it had also been liberating. For the first time since the colony's founding, both species were standing together against a common enemy. The conspiracy had been exposed, but the real work was just beginning. The morning air on Haven 7 felt different now, lighter somehow, as if the planet itself had exhaled a breath it had been holding for too long. 6 months had passed since the Harvest Festival broadcast that changed everything, and the transformation was visible everywhere you looked. Where once there had been separate settlements divided by walls and suspicion, now there were mixed neighborhoods where human and Valari families lived side by side. Minho stood in what had once been the neutral zone between the two communities, watching construction crews put the finishing touches on a building that would have been impossible to imagine a year ago. The structure itself was a perfect blend of human engineering and Valari organic architecture, with metal supports that curved like living branches and walls that seemed to breathe with the rhythm of the wind. A sign near the entrance read, "Nira, Institute for Interspecies Cooperation," in both human script and flowing Valari symbols. Today was the dedication ceremony, and beings from across Haven 7 had come to witness the opening of something that represented hope made real. The trials that followed the festival broadcast had been swift and decisive. Colonel Tai-hyung, Elder Thane, and dozens of other conspirators from both species now faced justice on their respective homeworlds. The evidence had been so overwhelming that even the most skeptical officials couldn't deny the scope of the betrayal. But, more importantly, the revelation had sparked changes that went far beyond punishment. New leaders had emerged, people who had always believed in cooperation but had been silenced by the old systems. Trade agreements that had been blocked for years were signed within weeks. Joint research projects began exploring everything from agriculture to medicine to the unique properties of Haven 7's crystal formations. Dr. Yunji approached Minho, her lab coat replaced by formal clothes for the ceremony. She carried a tablet showing the latest results from the agricultural projects that had grown out of Nira and Jinho's original work. "The hybrid crops are exceeding all projections," she reported with a smile. "We're not just food secure now, we're producing enough surplus to export back to Earth and the Valari homeworld. The supply ships that used to bring us expensive rations are now carrying our products to other colonies." Jinho emerged from the Institute building, looking healthier than he had in months. The grief would always be with him, but it had transformed into something productive. He had thrown himself into building the institute that would carry on Nira's work, ensuring that her vision of cooperation would outlive those who had tried to destroy it. "The memorial garden is ready," he announced, his voice carrying pride, mixed with lingering sadness. "I think she would have loved it." The garden was the centerpiece of the institute, a living symbol of what could be achieved when different species worked together. Earth roses grew alongside Valari, singing flowers, their roots intertwined in soil that had been enriched with microorganisms from both worlds. The plants supported each other, each species contributing something that helped the others thrive. As the dedication ceremony began, Kale took the stage to speak about the scientific collaborations that were already producing breakthrough discoveries. His voice carried the musical quality of his people, but his words were understood by everyone present. "6 months ago we lived in fear of each other," he said, gesturing toward the mixed crowd before him. "Today my research partner is a human xenobiologist, and together we have discovered things that neither of our species could have found alone." The crowd included faces that would have been unthinkable at such a gathering before the revelation. Former military officers sat next to Valari council members. Human children played with Valari younglings, their laughter creating a sound that transcended all the artificial barriers that had once divided their peoples. When it came time for Minho to speak, he felt the weight of everything that had brought them to this moment. He was no longer Private Minho, following orders without question. The military had offered him promotions and medals after the conspiracy was exposed, but he had chosen a different path. "I used to be a soldier," he began, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. "I was trained to see differences as threats, to maintain distance from those who weren't like me. But one morning, I heard a cry that changed everything. Nira's voice taught me that our greatest strength comes not from our weapons or our walls, but from our willingness to reach across the spaces that divide us." As he spoke, Minho looked out over the audience and saw the future that Nira had died believing in. Human and Valari couples sat together, their children playing at their feet. Scientists from both species compared notes on their latest discoveries. Artists collaborated on works that blended the aesthetic traditions of two worlds. The ceremony concluded with the lighting of the memorial flame, a crystal formation that would burn with light from both of Haven 7's suns. As the flame ignited, it cast rainbows across the garden, illuminating flowers that bloomed in colors that existed nowhere else in the galaxy. Children from both species ran through the garden, their voices mixing in games that required no translation. They were the first generation to grow up without the artificial barriers that had poisoned their parents' world. They would know Haven 7 not as a divided planet, but as a place where differences were celebrated rather than feared. As the sun set on the dedication ceremony, Minho walked through the memorial garden one final time. Near the center, beneath a tree that grew flowers in shades of silver and violet, stood a simple stone marker with Nira's name inscribed in both languages. "Thank you," he whispered to the stone, knowing that somewhere in the evening breeze that rustled the hybrid flowers, her spirit lived on in every act of cooperation, every bridge built between different peoples, every child who would grow up, seeing unity where their